kind of emasculated part, I used the term melting architecture to summarize the sort of thing I've been doing for the last 3 years. I think I used it for two reasons. On the one hand, because it seemed to be a kind of summary term that could apply to some of the characteristics which I want to apply to some of the projects. Those characteristics being that of contrast, of disintegrity, of mystery, of randomness, and yet, as a kind of paradox, the search for a method of structuring. And the term melting seemed to be to do with the fact that something has to be there in the first place before it can melt, but that whilst it's melting, it continues to be substantive. That the contrast of phenomena is perhaps seen as contrast only because we tend to have a rather finite view of things, and that perhaps it may be the same substance, it just tends to look different at certain points in time. And this whole interest in integrity, disintegrity, change, and so on. And I suppose this is the one, and I hope almost the only related feature of what I've been doing in the last 3 years to the sort of work that I was doing, say, 10 or more years ago, which was to do with things like plug-in cities and things that went bang in the night. That too, in its own sort of plonky way, was to do with things changing, falling about, and being maneuvered, not as gentle as melting, not as perhaps inconsequential, but there is somewhere a link. The work of the last 3 years really, I think, first of all, though, wants to be prefixed with an observation about this business of structure and this business of melting. The Darmstadt building, the Wedding Tower by Olbrich, has to be seen, I think, almost in snow, with perhaps the wrong exposure on the camera, and has to be seen with this grid of trees which filters it. It's spooky, it's heroic, it's highly architectonic, and yet at the same time it is better seen through trees with the detail missing, perhaps, than it is seen in a very bland and obvious elevation. For me, I'm fascinated by the Wedding Tower seen in the evening through the snow, through this grid of trees. It makes reference to the architecture that is made willfully, perhaps by the gridding of trees or by the device of a very curious top to a building. I mean, those two devices alone, I mean, the grid of the trees is something which perhaps is alluded to many times in this exhibition here, not in my work so much, but the whole business of finding frames of reference which are then etched away, or frames of reference which perhaps have a slightly more mathematical relationship and a conceptual relationship than an expressive one. And so the grid is a grid of growing things, and yet they're controlled by man, they're stated by man. Seen through them is this very, very pretty, very, very architectural object, which doesn't actually break the rules. And the building which you can't see at all, which is in fact rather the crummier part of Olbrich's pile, again, when seen in this spooky condition, sets up a whole sort of mystery of what is good, what is bad, how cogently was this grid thought of in terms of the tower. Was it thought of as something to be seen on a bright morning in midday, perhaps? Or was it seen as something of almost unexplainable heroism? And the whole business of architectural heroism fascinates me. I think it fascinates the people who have been speaking who are somewhat younger than me, because in a sense their generation has reacted to the heroism of the 50s and of the early 60s. And yet they, in their own statements, are being perhaps very heroic. And I show a slide which I'll come back onto, or similar slides, of this piece of fooling about behind me, this large mural, which again, in a contrived way, perhaps is trying to search for this same relationship of disintegrated structure, melting architecture, and at the same time things glimpsed. I think a better example, and one which raises other characteristics for me, is the business of working with and amongst and in response to natural formations. I often use, this is one of my favourite slides on the left, on the right here, which is a slide of a tree by the Thames. I think it's somewhere near Richmond. And I've often said about it, it's my favourite building. I really wish that one could make a building that was as good as this tree. It's consistent, and yet rather like looking into the traditional looking into the coal fire. There's always something new that you notice about it. It has overtones of emotionalism. You know, it's the weeping willow and the sad tree, and perhaps what is the mystery within it, and the whole of that bit. At the same time, it's just a tree. It's just a natural tree that's been planted by the river, and it's great. Whereas here we have nature again being held by a contrived situation. You go into this Delphinium house, or whatever the hell it is, and the architecture you are aware of, and in fact the whole Arcadian character of this particular architecture is necessarily related to the Arcadian character and the niceness, the prettiness of the objects within it. And yet they too are natural objects, and they are working with, or perhaps against, man's ability to contrive. Now, the other characteristic of both of these slides, and I will admit to it at an autobiographical level, is the Englishness of them. And I use the word English, I'm sorry, because it comes most naturally to me. It is this mixture of the picturesque, the quiet, the gentle, the reasonable, the almost still river with the nice sad tree, the small building with the delicate tracery. The inoffensiveness of the whole thing, I think, is a very essential part of what I would describe as the wet liberal English culture, and which is, let us face it, my own culture. And so I deliberately then have to contrast an old slide, a collage made of various middle period archigram objects, presented as a rather boring collage actually as I look back at it now, presented a series of semi-heroic inventions, but for the purposes of making an artwork, presented in a gentle, or an attempt at a gentle manner, contrasted with heroism and mystery and contrivance. Now all the time, the other part of my own culture, which I have to admit to, along with Englishness, along with English wet liberalism, is the business of the architect, or the discusser of architecture, as I suppose all of us could be branded as. The mixture of things as found and things as contrived. And all the time I find myself coming back to the use that man has made of things that naturally happen. By which I mean both nature, vegetation, natural forms, landscape, trees, etc., but also circumstances, the things that naturally happen in everyday life, circumstantial things, and the degree to which you contrive them, the degree to which you allow them to happen in a laissez-faire way, or the degree to which you coerce them. This, after all, bushes don't really grow like that. They can be coerced into growing like that. And seen again on a fulsome sunny day, look rather cute. Seen on a misty day, start to acquire other overtones. There are precedents. In the discussion of heroism, I have to admit that one of my heroes for probably the last 16 years has been Bruno Tart. More particularly, I suppose, in his writings than in his buildings, although he did some pretty fantastic things. And I have to admit that coming myself to design things that look like mountains and strange cute little objects happening in amongst landscape. I must admit that Bruno Tart was doing it in 1917, not perhaps in quite the same way. But there is an essential difference of his cultural approach, which I think was to make the Alpine city a heroic place, a fantastic place, an incredible place, and there, bang on the top of the highest hill, was this thing which, if you look at some of the drawings of it, is remarkably anticipatory of Bucket Fuller domes. But that's kind of by the way. And the contrast of the perhaps Germanic or perhaps forcibly heroic object, which purports also to relate to the landscape, and the traditionally North European, quaint, twee, delightful little vignette. The seat, obviously in a rich house. I mean, the curious thing about this is that it's very small, and actually would be quite cheap to make. I mean, it's of the scale and niceness of some of Pete and Jean's pick-up models. And yet, for various reasons, we read it immediately as the plaything of a rich and elite culture. But that notwithstanding, I think these two things summarize a whole part of my culture, which is, on the one hand, the coyness, the niceness, the romanticness, the picturesqueness, and the quietness of an event such as that, a seat amongst a tree. On the other hand, the incredible things, the admiration for the example of people like those who produced Fröhlich magazine in 1917 in Berlin in a heroic situation and were amongst the movers who got the modern movement off the ground. And I suppose I'm saying that everything that I have ever done has been caught between, and perhaps is the necessary result of the abrasion of these two cultures. And one can then draw a very simple response from that by saying, on the one hand, heroism can be read against the determinate things, the structured things, the architectural things, the forceful things, and sometimes, let's face it, the least sensitive things. And the wet English liberal thing is reasonable, gentle, wayward, sometimes imaginative, sometimes spooky, which is one of my favorite words, things. And just two projects for housing, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, but are not actually separated very much in time. On the one hand, a place made so that different kinds of people can coexist together in the same piece of housing, so that the rich man, the architectural student, the hillbilly, the conceptual artist, and the gadabout can in this rather naive conjunction exist together. As against our project for Roosevelt Island, which is very much to do with a simple sort of between the eyes contrast of two symbolic aspects of building. On the one hand, the outer, this is a section drawing, the outer part of the building, which is presented as a single, unadulterated, highly unpleasant cylinder of louvers, 300 feet in diameter, which belies the actuality of the inside of the thing, which is incredibly focusy in every piece of every edge of every house being designed by the occupants, so that you get everything from Gothic and Wimpy Bar and so on and so on. And it's making a very deliberate contrast of the outside to the inside, and then various things which in their normal architectural way follow on from this, which is that the outside is of the scale of the whole of New York and the Hudson River and so on, and the inside is of the little tiny quasi-English scale of the front door, the gate, the child in the pram, and the pieces of tongue and grooved boarding. And one can therefore, when you look back on these projects, one asks of oneself, in which project was the tongue most furthest in the cheek? Or is it necessary to produce work sometimes in deliberate contrast to other work that you've done in order to try to move on and to try to find what your true center is? The curious thing is that one gets so flummoxed in this that I can't myself tell, and in a funny way I regard both schemes as actually being to do with the same thing, which, if it's confusing for me, surely must be pretty confusing for you. Nevertheless, on the one hand, just to pursue the previous slide further, the whole context for that piece of cheek-by-jowl dwelling was a series of villages that would be infiltrated into hedgerows in the backwoods of Essex. Very gentle things done mysteriously behind hedges. I haven't exhibited that here this time because it was in the Ricky DeMarco show that we had about 3 years ago, or 2, whenever it was in Edinburgh at last. Contrasted with just a plug for a heroic building done by a German architect called Ludwig Leo in Berlin, in the center of Berlin. It's a sort of hydraulics laboratory. There are times when there's a mixture of just this suddenly finding again that architecture was all right. You know, you sort of say, Christ, I can't explain it, but if guys do things like that, then architecture must be all right. If I can extend that, I mean, it attacks one on several levels. First of all, that if you describe to somebody that in the center of a sophisticated city there is a building which has a large pink pipe, a blue top, and stands on green legs, they probably think you're a bit bonkers. If you then say that this man who designed it works intensively, neurotically, and almost without any assistance for years and years producing just 1 or 2 buildings, you then find that his whole architectural linkage is with people like Ungers and the whole post-war Berlin mafiosi. If you then say that, in fact, this comes nearest to the manifestation of the Russian constructivist drawings such as those made by Chernikov, you get into an extremely complex cultural situation, and the best thing to do is to shut up and say, look, it's really great, let's cut the crap. There is still momentarily the occasion when high architecture works. Of course, the paradox there is that a lot of other architects hate buildings like this and would deny greatly that they're high architecture. But again, it's this cultural unease that on the one hand one does have the fact that high architecture can work when it's done extremely well, that other forms of let's call it low architecture can become extremely tedious because there doesn't seem to be anything left except romance. Which leads me to a project which perhaps is the first in a series where one tries desperately to relate both the let's call it the architectonic with the wayward. And of course the trick is that it is to do with disintegrity, not integrity. After all, most of us who were brought up in the aftermath of the Bauhaus, brought up by the generation who perhaps first was beginning to get a bit irritated with the Bauhaus but had still not weaned itself from it. Integrity was, whilst I was a student, a goodie word. If something was designed in an integrative way, it was a plus factor. If something began to disintegrate or was claimed to be disintegrative, it was a baddie word, and you were a bit loose in the joints. This is a project called Urban Mark, originally done for a competition, not finished on time, and so just worked on afterwards. A competition run by Casabella, and it was to do with notions of the city. And what I did was to take the very simplest mark that you can make almost, which is just a cross, and first of all state it as a lattice, as a statement of space, and to state it in pragmatic terms as a steel structure. Heard that phrase before. And also to state, it's upside down, doesn't matter, to state it as a kind of emotive statement of a cross that could contain high tension situations, if you like, in an emotive sense, not an architectural sense. And the first stage is to fill it in with, let us call it latter-day plug-in city filling. But, of course, it was, in my own terms, later, and one couldn't just make everything nice, rounded, cornered metal boxes and so on. There were a whole lot of internal paradoxes in the filling in of steel structure with a quote-unquote town. And so there are some things that are very casual, tents on decks which are eaten, tents that lean over decks, prefabricated buildings, ordinary buildings, and so on. And the storyline of the urban mark is a story of disintegration. First of all, slightly nasty things start to happen. Nasty, and again I'm parodying the whole architectural culture with which one was brought up. Slightly nasty things, the putting in of inconsistent buildings amongst the consistent, the taking away of the neatly and conveniently prefabricated, the incursion of people doing their own thing, the incursion of very unpleasant huts. Of course, with one's very uptight training, it's extremely difficult to design a nasty hut with a door in the wrong place, because one's whole background is to suggest that you start having art worry at every level. And I think that's a general observation about a lot of the things that here I will group myself with the younger people, that many of us do, that even when we're flying in the face of a tradition, we experience art worry, where by doing almost the obverse of what we are trying to avoid, we are paying it tremendous homage. And it's an interesting observation that Peter Smithson and I were just making earlier, that in fact this show is an art show when you boil it down. And many of the statements that have been made in the last 2 hours or so are art statements, and that we are actually sitting right inside an absolutely stultifying tradition, but I digress. The storyline continues, and eventually this neatly delineated cross melts into the ground. It melts more and more. At this stage there are just a few vestiges of what was there before. And in the final stage, one has a kind of amoebic, nothing terrain, which in biblical terms, I think one would make that quote of, earth to earth and dust to dust and ashes to ashes, or whatever it is. That there is perhaps a paradigm of the civilization that has disintegrated, all that is left is stones and strange things. On the other hand, I am amused by my own paradox on this last drawing, that perhaps that architecture is in fact the most sophisticated of the lot, that in fact the civilization that's living inside this thing has moved so far beyond our rather uptight four-square situations in the first drawing, that in fact it's quite the converse. It's a highly optimistic statement of an other architecture. And at that point, one abandons the scheme and moves on. And a recapitulation of one piece of the scheme really leads to some later work, which is this, back to front, but it doesn't matter, this piece of architecture in a strip. It's a strip which has kind of Jim Sterling building, castle building, early period architrave building, prefabricated building, and a vegetable building. And they all have windows, and they all have tops, and they all sit fairly reasonably in the strip. And they even have entrances. And so at this stage, the vegetable building has a lot of architecture of the normal kind in it. It's just that it's twisted a bit, but it still has orifices, it still has undulations, it has a top and a bottom. And which led, and I lost some slides last week, and it really buggers me, but anyhow, this is more or less simultaneous drawing done to illustrate for Casabella the story of the secret garden. And here one uses the same vegetable formation in a quasi-building to say something else about architecture. It's back to this business of the coy, perhaps the romantic, which is that the notion of the secret garden, I don't just mean the novel, but the general idea of a secret garden thought of and seen by a child, is that with the memory of childhood is almost the fact that we have forgotten that a child isn't concerned necessarily about paradox as such, isn't concerned about scale, isn't concerned about consistency, or on the other hand inconsistency, isn't concerned about architecture, isn't concerned about windows looking like windows, or tops looking like tops, or sides looking like sides. You say to a child, imagine a garden, and they do imagine a garden, and perhaps in this garden are things in which people might live, and which are perhaps scaleless, but have certain characteristics. Now, the paucity of the result is that still I'm no longer a child when I do that drawing, and I still tend to make these orifices look rather the same as each other, and I still tend to crown the top and indicate something slightly architectural. And in the final analysis, I'm disappointed. The attempt has failed. I am not a child. I think in terms of consistencies and scale and hierarchy. But the attempt perhaps is necessary and leads to then the question, if that previous work was to do with an attempt at disintegrity, leads then to another device for melting architecture, which is the coercion or the contrivance of mystery. What attracts one to the joke English countryside, or the real English countryside, depending on how cynical you're feeling, is that it is unencumbered by built events. There is a road actually, but the built events seem to be reasonable, to use that terrible word, albeit that actually enclosure acts and the like have made the pattern come as it does. This is a project for an incision into the countryside, not a piece of architecture that stands proudly on the hill, but a piece of architecture that is only discovered when you're almost right up upon it. The original version of this was done in Edinburgh, as it happens, in the old Melville Crescent gallery of Ricky DeMarco in the basement. I'm sure it's been taken away, but it might still be there. I don't know, I haven't bothered to look. And the notion was that in a piece of countryside there would be the event of building, and that the business of a man making a house might be a man just sinking a piece of ground, using the most sophisticated plate and glazing that you like, but just gently wrapping it into the ditch as found. That there would be certain incisions in the ground, but whether or not they contain anything wouldn't really matter, or certainly wouldn't be immediately identifiable. So perhaps that's just a crevice. Perhaps this is just a row of trees and a ditch, perhaps a stream, but question mark, what's that in the corner? And developing out of this has become slightly more elaborate holes in the ground that are certainly contrived. And some of them developing into a place that has a whole rather complex presence. And here we then re-enter this whole question of control and choice and lattice works. Are they real lattice works? Are they conceptual lattice works? Is this simply an indication of perhaps an attitude of scale towards the surface? Is it an indication where a structure might be placed? Is this a picture of the structure? Or is it a further indication that the natural can be interlaced with the contrived? Or is it much simpler than that? Is it actually just a lattice sunk into a pit where the trees can grow on it, and sometimes you can hang walls on it? And it doesn't really matter to me at which level one interprets it. But there are other things going on. The whole business of enclosure fascinates me tremendously, so I'm still very much a real old architect, because I'm fascinated by the business of wrapping, of being able to look through things or not look through things, being able to relate to a space or not, being able to say that this can be made by a very gentle object, or a very contrived object, or a very plumpy object, or a very plumpy object. And so these two I just thought were worth sticking in because they're of the original Edinburgh version, where I drew bits and pieces of architecture down in London on the drawing board, took lots of die-line prints of them, brought them up to Edinburgh, and then started having a go at the DeMarco wall and making the quite dense gridding and corners and so on, and then wrapping the countryside around it. In the version that's standing over there, the whole thing is placed in a different emphasis where I think the countryside is the major element and the incision is much gentler. And as a sort of almost final observation about that project, one then starts to look at such things as 3 trees in a row, not quite so inconsequentially as one might have done so before. Are those 3 trees part of the architectural system, or did they just grow like that? Are they part of the rural organization? Or is that organization itself part of the architectural system? Or, in other words, what is contrivance and what is a place as found? It leads, this is just another little piece of it, one of probably my favorite bit actually, where the architectural formation is extremely contrived, extremely geometrical, and even the same ground line suddenly becomes total glass in highly heroic way. That the edge of the grass is defined by a piece of building, and then suddenly the other edge is just lost in the landscape. That's very much a building. It just so happens to be dug in rather than dug out. This is a AD cover that was based on the same idea. A bit jokey, this one, because you know, there are things like this bush with a door in it, so this bloke actually living in the bush. A hedge with some roofing on it, so there's another bloke actually living in the ditch. And a field with, you can't really see them, but there's sheep. But there's another bloke living in this house with the sheep, presumably sort of wandering over it and crapping on it. It's sort of popular version of the same project. A little urban project here, which was for a rethink of the Earl's Court site as an exhibition centre, with a very similar brief to that which one might have for an Earl's Court building, hotels, a container port virtually, and an exhibition centre under the ground. And here one was looking in a funny way at the same problems as with the ambiguous scheme before, where one suddenly stops this very, very latter-day plug-in city situation of containers coming in along the railway, unloading and forming outdoor exhibitions. Very mechanistic, very boxy, bright colours, walkways, lots of people, lots of things happening. And then suddenly it is absorbed into this mysterious hall which is under the ground here. And there's a buffer zone which is a kind of lip, a kind of, rather like the thing you get under a door, a draft stopper under a door, which is sort of floppy. The door is there, it's very definite, the floor is there, it's very definite, but there's this sort of thing that takes the one up and the other. And that's what that was about. And yet the lip itself, which is a sort of painted glaze with curved top, all very nice, is itself absorbed into the ground. The ground is then fragmented to take this lip, and then finally they disappear into the ground, except that then you have these 3 rather heroic hotels that night in on. And occasionally this thing uncomfortably carries on, so that just when you're getting used to a certain kind of architectural statement, let's say this neo-rationalist statement here, the whole system breaks down because you've hit this lip. Just when you're getting used to that, it becomes a mechanistic thing. And just when you're getting used to that, you hit the back of the Edwardian terrace, So you're never very comfortable, which of course leads me to another observation, which is I suppose many of us in this room, and I will deliberately bracket together a lot of other people who are part of the show as well as myself, a lot of us are sort of fighting within, with perverse, we're deliberately perverse, we're fighting the system, using the techniques of drawing and architectural comment and proportion and neat corners. I mean, we all want our drawings to be straight at the corner. It's an interesting, nobody's sort of come along with something that's taffy at the bottom, really, not intentionally so anyhow. And in that way, I think we're making as strong a architectonic statement as anybody else. Ah, this is where we discover that the thing. Thank you. So the business of contrivance and edge conditions isn't so mysterious. It is where one is playing deliberate tricks and one is deliberately inverting. And I just thought I'd show you the ground plan of the Roosevelt scheme, the one with the cylinder outside and folksy inside, because in fact underneath that itself is another game of mysterious landscape, very much in the English tradition going on. Which brings me then to the lump, which is mainly that set of plastic frame drawings, the small ones. The lump is, I suppose, to do with the randomness of elements of architecture. I really enjoyed using the word lump. In fact, I think it was one of those projects where the word came first and the rest came afterwards. The idea of lump, for me, was a real fingers to the whole of one's architectural upbringing, you know, that it, whether based on Bauhaus precepts or not, lump was fingers to all that. It's anything, it's just stuff, it's just not only amorphous, but there it is. And so in this evocation of the lump, Mont Saint-Michel is shown against a lump of the same configuration. But Mont Saint-Michel is hierarchical, has edges, has identifiable objects. It is compounded and very heroic. The lump's just a lump. And again, I think one can symbolize this with just a sort of bit of look back. A pulsing lump, which once you start really looking at it, still has many of the usefulnesses of architecture going for it. And just lump, just stuff, just nice glaze lump, with no particularization, could be anywhere. Or, what's the name of this? Someone Walker, who was in 1928 doing watercolors, including one which I irritatingly, after I'd done the scheme, discovered he'd called I Love the Lump. And an early version of mine, again the muted colours are quite deliberate. This was meant to be a kind of lump such as the ones that you see in Wild West films, where you see this thing in the distance and it's all kind of red and rocky and they ride up to it and then somebody shoots. And other lumps. I mean, sometimes you get this whole. I realise, of course, that there's another cultural hang-up, which is the whole fascination that I think probably the last 50 years has had for pile-up buildings, the A-frame structure, particularly people like Henri Salvage, who do it really rather brilliantly, but the whole pile-up building thing, back to the pyramid, back to the Aztec city thing. A rather crass example from Hawaii. And our own Monte Carlo lump, which was the notion of remaining a piece of landscape whilst having a very sophisticated building inside the thing. So it keeps cropping up. Some lump types, appalling photograph, but you can see it over there for real. Some lump types, the shell building, the Matlin Terraces at London Zoo, which was Warren's discovery as a lump. The same guy in 1928, and a Brazilian, is it Brazilian or or south of France, somewhere, lump with a crowning object on the top of it. Another preoccupation, which for time reasons I won't go into very much, but I've long had a preoccupation with the notion of a building where windows as such would not occur. You would simply go from dense through opaque, through translucent, more translucent, transparent, gleaming, and back down again. You just get this thing that was a building, but you couldn't define where the window started because it was all window or not window, and where it just came up the ground and then went back into it in degrees of transparency. And that's been a sort of running fascination for me for the last 10 years, and it's a building I would most like to build. If anybody, says, okay, in your lifetime you can build one thing, I say, right, that's it, let's see if we can do this. Make this thing where you don't have any of that doors and windows and the ground stops and the top and the bottom. It just is and then isn't. It's an underlying one which you'll see cropping up a bit later. These are two of the three main drawings there of the approved lump, if you like. The lump first seen with naturalistic landscape, but a few rather strange things cropping up in amongst it, things that perhaps couldn't possibly be bushes or mud or shingle or whatever. Moving round the lump, you then discover that there are very definitely some strange things going on that perhaps are of an architectural nature. I've lost the last slide, but it's the third one on the right, where you discover that actually there's a very styled opening into this thing, and it's actually a building all the time, which shows a certain weakness of my own detachment about the situation, because the whole point about the lump initially was that the lump was amorphous and was non-architectural. And I found after working on the idea for about 9 months, I came back to making it into a building, which I find very curious, self-condemnatory observation. I don't know what's happened there. This was then a sort of sly dig at my own thing of saying, well, what happens if you take the building most anachronistic to that of lumpen architecture, of melting architecture? Take an office block, an ordinary office block with floors of the right distance apart and air conditioning and, bosses and minions and Duralandschaft and the whole bit. And then throw the lumpen architecture at it. The nearest analogy I can think of for this is scrambled egg on toast, where it's essential to have the toast, and then the egg can never quite be sat conveniently on it. There's always a bit that drags over the side, there's always a bit of the toast that sticks out, and a bit of the toast that gets very soaked up with the sort of wet egg, and another bit of toast where it's just lying on the top. And this is almost directly what happens here. The lumpen architecture is heaved at the straight office block and cancerously eats into it, which one can see from the plan, because I couldn't prevent myself twisting the plan at the initial, which again says something about my architectural culture. But the scrambled egg part, the lumpen part, is eating, and sometimes eating quite far into the thing. And the rest tries to survive, but of course what is actually happening is that the reverse is true, that the office block is surviving terribly well, and what happens is those office workers walk out onto the lump during their lunch hour and have a great time. So that, as somebody said to me, really you really still support the establishment, because in fact it is the establishment element, i.e. the office building, that is still there in the final analysis. It's been kicked around a bit and almost threatened by the lump, but it's still there. And I suppose one could say it's a sort of parody of this conflict between structure, establishment, tradition, identifiability, consistency, integrity against things hitting it, but it always sort of soldiers on. In other words, what I'm saying is that I still regard all the things that I'm doing as within the architectural tradition, and rather like the pruning of a tree, part of the recreative aspect of it, and not fundamentally knocking it. Now, it's an awful admission to make, but I'll keep moving. The final project, and one which I've more or less finished now, one that occupied most of last year when I wasn't pissing about with ArtNet, is called Sponge. And the first drawing I made was this one, which is a typical plan. It's called a typical plan, I think. And attempted to establish the base story, which is that sponge architecture, rather like a bath sponge, which is absorptive and rejective and can be squeezed, pummeled, and is very inconsistent, can exist around an existing building. So this could be seen as a plan of an existing building, which has been etched away but is still there, and sponge wrapped around it. Or could be seen as a new building where one establishes a hard series of elements and a soft series of elements, except that the murk is meant to imply that even this hard area has many inconsistencies within it. And I then drew a series of skin conditions and bits, ideas about orifices, what would happen to the skin, the fact that it could be gunged together. Pieces of consistent skin could then have what I call gunge areas, where it just is made up rather like using chewing gum and mud and whatever, and then you carry on with the very sleek thing again, which I rather like the feeling of. You know, we tend to make buildings either very hairy buildings or very smooth buildings, but why not a smooth building that for its completeness depends upon incredibly hairy patches here and there? We do this, after all, when we convert. And then the idea was to take a series of elements, to take elements of the skin, elements of the inside, rather taking as my organizational model something like Palladio's 4 books of architecture, where things are stated as parts, and the parts are then built up into a suggested vocabulary. And so I proceeded, and I tried always to make the 3-dimensional part of it a square picture in the middle, and then the bits and pieces around the edge. And you can see how bad I am at sticking to my story, because after I'd done 2 or 3 of these, they sort of took over, and they don't actually, it doesn't quite happen as neatly as that. And so each of the parts here are the 9 drawings in the corner there, start to have their own personality. By the time I get to this one, which I don't put the slide of here, the melting forest, which is supposed to be to do with the idea of the established element of architecture, the centralized, identifiable staircase going up to heaven, as it were, forcing its way through like a knife through a piece of porridge, through this much more amoebic sponge architecture. And in fact, it becomes its own thing, and it's not really to do with vocabulary at all. Anyhow, this is about sleekness, the feeling that even those immaculate West Coast architects, such as the MJM or Cesar Pelli, are incapable of actually getting to a point of sleekness, such as is represented by this picture of cream oozing its way over very gooey jam. I mean, there's a sort of tactile feel about that architecture is practically unable to reach, and that one suggests a sleek building where then the occasional imperfection, like the beauty spot on a beautiful woman's face, draws attention to her beauty. So there's a necessary built-in sort of paradox. There's another aspect, which is the cancerous growth. In this case, a reversal out of the landscape drawing, where the cancerous growth of the vegetation is sort of threatening and attacking the totality of the beautiful, sleek face. That's a reworked version of it.
Of reminding, the business of reminding industry that they require art, not just paintings on the wall, that they require Paul Riley and the Design Council to get them out of a nasty sort of balance book sheet. That sort of business didn't actually affect Newies when they first mass-produced in the early 19th century the safety pin. And we haven't even got the name of the author of that, and he never got a design award, and it would never be called art unless it's done 10 times too big and doesn't work. So there must be something to do with art in industry that can't immediately be found useful, but must be enriching. Now, why should anyone want to enrich Chrysler's or Norton Villiers' Triumph, or indeed the candle shops, or the buggy whip manufacturers, or the corn dolly manufacturers of Thaxted? I mean, if we're going to just say that art is good for industry because it, in fact, gives it another lease of life, both through its social justification and a certain amount of subliminal moral justification by those who are propagating the industry, then, in fact, we're boring whores. I mean, we're not boring them, we are boring whores. Very difficult to find how, in fact, do you remember the embarrassment when, for 1 year, the Beatles' records were a bigger dollar earner than Scotch whisky? It only happened once, 1 year. Very embarrassing. There's a borderline. Jerseys, booze, insurance. Yes, it's marginal. It doesn't have too much sweat of the brow, etc., etc. And it's tricky to insert art into it over and above the initial input. But that at least is accepted as industry. But when, in fact, something which appears to be nothing more than the sort of thing you do in that period allowed by the haves to the have-nots in order to keep them under control, i.e. leisure periods, when that appears to be an industry, then, in fact, no one says introduce art into the Beatles or whatever it is now. No one encourages that. They don't have a slot in the Haymarket. I'm going on a bit long, but the nice thing is I can tell when I'm going on a bit because Peter's eyelids drop. Unless he shoves a finger on his left nostril and they open again. Right. Now, I would like to think that an enormous amount of profit has been obtained from nationalized industries in enabling all of us to gather here tonight through fairs. I would like to think that there is a support for the potteries industry through people's appetite for coffee, but not through their appetite in returning their cups. There is a range over and above that. That's all just take it as found. What I think several times ArtNet in its very short life has suggested, and there's a difference between single-minded bloody-mindedness and elitism, and that's the difference between ArtNet and the ICA, I would suggest, but that's another thing. However, I think that there are aspects that we are responsible. We're a bit too sloppy with ourselves. I think there are aspects that we can do, never mind whether it's called industry. It will be an industry if it is useful. And one of the big uses needed in this country is some way to make us smile and for me to get the attention of that man at the back who's also picking his nose. Now that is industry. Work out the art content later. So I mean, for instance, you spend less calories fancying a bird than you do cutting coal, but you spend exactly the same amount of time, but use less food. So there's a certain amount of energy conservation. Having got onto that particular aspect of cutting coal and looking at ladies, there's an inside-outside situation which I do think is often ignored. It was referred to by Alison and Peter in the ArtNet magazine in relation to the I hate calling them pictures. Thingies is all right. Picture thingies. However, open question, because of the time. When I had an exhibition recently of old, oh, excuse me, it's the coffee, of old doodles. I'm glad that's off. Old doodles. And there was book you could write comments in. And there were rude ones. I mean, there was Uriah Heep wrote humbling, and underneath, Mies van der Rohe wrote humiliating. But there was one person who wrote, "This reminds me of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic." Now, I haven't met her, but I think she's probably nearest. The most accurate summary on the whole bizarre business. And the situation as a particular design aspect that interests me is that a few years, when Imperial Airways did their flying boats and things, they put in, and the big thingies, the big balloons, the Zeppelins, but the civil ones, they put in deck chairs in the Zeppelins, and they put in straw chairs which you could move around in the overseas airways thing. Very shortly after, people were rather bored about this because the means of transport became faster, the seaplanes are faster, and they wanted a speed image in so much as they were directed in one way and they had a porthole of their own. And you got the very nice earlier tubular seats, etc., etc. Then, eons of years later, because I haven't time to go through the entire history, the Council of Industrial Design a few years ago approved designs produced by Gaby Schreiber for BOAC that in fact had antimacassars, quilted chairs, and curtains on the windows. This was then, people were feeling perhaps the thing was too expensive, was going rather fast. It was just after the comet crash. And so there was make-believe introduced again. Now, the inside-outside thing is often unrelated to the enjoyment of the people inside if they feel safe. I mean, the interesting thing on the train tonight was that it isn't anything like as much fun to sit in as a train where you can feel that you are in a shape that's moving fast, because it isn't reassuring as a square shape. It's just nothing, and the window. Oh, that's a suggestion. I think it's rather bad, and it was a Council of Industrial Design approved interior. But the point I'm making is that because something like Concorde has come along, all that chat about handling the inside, irrespective of the outside, has gone because they're short of space. And the advertising now is back to feel yourself in a cigar tube moving at speed. And the styling is as such. Now, I'm not quite sure whether it's as important, except for the designer, I'm not quite sure whether it's as important from outside to get a feeling of what's going on inside. I'm not sure about that. That obviously brings us on to words. And Great North Road, State Highway, as opposed to Route 11 and the M1. We very often choose words for what we do through convenience of in-group usage, but the words stay on. And you can't get, I don't know, I think you can't get much mileage out of your own club word unless it is sufficiently sort of fey and tummy-turning as something like Fun Palace. Then you get mileage because people can't believe you were serious. And whether one was or not allows them to go on guessing. Now the word condition in relation, for instance, to the exhibition here is best tested by yourselves as reading the Yellow Book. The Yellow Book isn't automatically, I mean the ArtNet book isn't automatically, as far as I know, related to objects on the wall. Some are directly related, others aren't. Whether in fact the word situation is another generative design feed, quite apart from the two-dimensional or indeed three-dimensional visual situation, as far as answering that question 3, which you may have forgotten, of course, which fields have been ignored and required to be strengthened, is something which I think we should ask ourselves, because this is a plea not in an age of poverty, which we're not. We're in an age of enormous wealth because we've got time to waste our time. because no one's going to pay for it. The danger of a lot of architectural effects. When did I start? 7:10. Did I start at 7:10? Seems like a lifetime ago, he said. It was 7:10, I think. Was it?
Yes.
Right, so I finished at 28. I just have to time it. Nothing like an interruption like that. It puts me off more than anyone else. The level at which we determine, quite apart from the brilliance of hanging that bottom particular picture on the left hand, which keeps grabbing me, the brilliance of particular display should very easily be transferred to the brilliance, and I'm talking about social brilliance and smiling. I mean, really important things now should be easily transferable to a process that anyone can enjoy without having it explained to them. But it's difficult to transfer it to a product. Production and consumption are never or seldom described as works of art, or indeed described as our heritage. They are usually put down as a statistic, rather like blood temperature or the death rate. However, production and consumption are key to whatever we do. Back to Mrs. Thatcher again. That's really the subtitle of tonight's talk. Mooning with Maggie in the market. The sort of, back to Thatcher. Here she was. The same day she came out with that far-sighted brilliance to the unions, it was pointed out that someone had found the way around the Mobile Home Act 74. Now, this was trying to give people who lived in caravans and mobile homes a little bit more security. In fact, the old racket goes on, and that is that the people who run the mobile home park have it written into the Constitution that you don't bring your caravan into the park, you buy one of his. They also have it written into the arrangement, and this is 90% of the mobile parks in this country, that after a certain period of years, to be determined by him, your caravan is likely to be rather scruffy in comparison with the neighbours, and you must turn yours in for a better one, which you get off him. However, should you go, you must take your caravan with you, because he must have a space for someone else to play the same trick on again. Now, that sounds wicked. We must stop that. Tories and Labour united against it. However, take the money element out. Take the greed element out. Think of the object. Write the sentence out again. If you move house, you must have a new one. If you leave the area and go somewhere else, you must have a new one. While you're in a place, quite irrespective of how long you live, if your house gets scruffy, there must be a new one. We don't actually, funny enough, with cooks. Better have that microphone back on. With cooks, there's all this claptrap. No, it's fine. They're artists, work of art, food, marvellous, eat it, wonderful work of art. Not everyone photographs their meal. Production and consumption there is an art form. We don't actually satisfy our appetite by reading cookery books, though on looking at the Sundays you'd think we could. This obviously brings me on to the next point, which is it worries me in looking at a lot of work here, particularly the baseline of the work here, that architects are not very interested in accommodating slopes, both dry and wet ones. I mean, tides and hills. thought that was rather interesting. There's some exceptions. There's some exceptions, but not many. Yes. Now, in reference to the book, just another aside, really, unless I can find where I was going to put it in. Yes, I've found it. Point in the book produced, well, there's one section in the book where it talks about the situation requiring vocabulary. I think this is important. I think it's not only important as design tool, I think it's important as a pre-artifactual impact exchange that doesn't louse up people who learn the vocabulary. Like you don't have to learn what a housing list means prior to knowing whether you like noisy living rooms or not. But I'm not sure that the object requiring definition is anything more than self-indulgent on our parts. And I find that very questionable. Because I don't think that architecture is, I don't think it's an indicator or indeed a synthesizer of activities, real or imagined. I think it's a vehicle, possibly even a sponge, that can be used at intervals for a limited time for an extension of human appetites hitherto thought impossible. And one such appetite is to enable the making up of one's mind to be a delight which is self-paced and not dictated by fear of indecision or the suspicion of the consequences of alien decision processes, local elections, housing lists, insurance policies. Thank you. Two minutes under time? I didn't read the Financial Times book.
And all the people in this hall were forward of that hall.
Perhaps mention the person who they like to kick off and answering it, right? I don't know, we'll just play it by ear, I guess.
Why does one not have problems with Finster and Tower retrospectively? Whereas when you see Newtown or Newark, you know that you're one suspicious of it. I mean, is it that the actual the climate of you know, glut and self-indulgence at other levels was totally acceptable in 1900. And much less acceptable now. I think it's a general culture. Where's Cedric? Talk some more about self-indulgence, Cedric.
Well, I was listening. That would be indulgent.
Surely,
Carry on.
that you say the so-called self-indulgence was forced on people like Town and Princeton and Macintosh, and you see in it the terrible tragedy of when one's self is self-indulgent. You're marking time, you're having to do something because you're not being asked to do something. And this is the horror of seeing somebody collage it up and, you know, inflate it like these Americans, is that all the horror of the sweat that they went through to make it, you know. seems like cracked cheese.
But I mean that is wholly that sort of self-generated self-indulgence through their presumably through some sort of bad processing, whether it was education or whatever, in an early stage. But I mean you two, if you have spare time, which is a difficult thing to define, don't collage things up particularly. I mean what I mean is that self-indulgence isn't directly related to having time on your hands, because there's always...
It depends on the quality of the self-indulgence. I don't call that American stuff self-indulgent. I mean, you maybe do. But it's when you have time to do these things like is you're just doing it because that's all you can perhaps do in the trenches, a sketch on a pan, dream of glass castles. But when it actually comes to the grind, one of the touts has to push off to Japan because he can't get any work in Germany, and the other just has to plow on with teaching and what he can do.
But I mean, yes, but I mean that is the point is that probably is something to do with the initial sort of extrusion process, which they call education, because they're never taught actually to ever even mentally be predictive, so that there's an awful gap until they're asked to do something. But I mean, the instantaneous response to a particular problem is almost too slow. However much that's twisting words, you know, that's the trouble. That if in fact people have no method of generating the next stage of work or of thinking over and above outside inputs, like being short of food or being given a job or being told that they can teach and find safety or whatever, then there is a self-indulgence because they are wasting their life. If they're not working in a predictive way. And if you work in a predictive way, you don't have spare time. You can't afford to carry on with something much longer than at any one time you can assess it in your own terms of reference. I'm talking, I'm taking the point of a person being isolated in the sort of conventional sense. You know, there's no work coming in, or they have a pension, or they're under school leaving age, or whatever. And that I think is something which, unfortunately, architectural education tends to encourage. People sit around and think, I got through that program, what's the next one?
But doesn't that go right back to the primary school, Cedric?
Yes, yes, it does.
The whole notion of being human. I can't see the dear boy. I mean, it's really rather chronic. Once children go through school, where, well, like you, this requires a footnote that if one accepts professionalism as such, that is, that there are people who do both design training, so it's not you. Similarly, there are people who are teachers who are, you ask because they know more to teach children they know about the pacing of the child's brain more than a parent does, because generally, until you've had 3 or 4 children, you can't remember that far back. So the profession is supposed to do like we're supposed to know about keeping the rain out. But in fact, the ordinary state education is singularly it doesn't try to teach a child to select within the information that's provided for it, or the priorities that the media is putting on it, the outside pressures we talk about in the professional situation, are the same need to put in those pressures from the smallest dot. That's actually the saturation of the most potent thing, television. You know, you think in Germany or England, where the state education is part of a long-established tradition, which is supposed to produce independent working class, which, by becoming independent, would eliminate the working class at work. It would eliminate, which was a different work, it was a different kind of equality, I suppose. That is, it was working gentlemen, as it were, which is what I thought was going to happen after the war here. But that whole notion of independence being valuable, you know, simply is the child has become part of the state's machine somehow, right from 4 or 5 years old. And what's weird is that as they've actually been taught to read, therefore they're not just independent on their teachers by the time they reach the universities. They could have taught self-paced themselves into another situation, because you don't have to read what the state puts out. You don't have to watch television, or you don't have to believe what Paul Riley tells you about the nature of art and industry.
But you, unfortunately, you do if you want to get your degree. You see, although I agree that historically, I mean, I don't think there's much to choose. I don't think there's much to choose on the credit side between state education, I mean, as you mentioned it, state education and private education. Though historically, I can see the justification of state education, which was a production process for products so defined by you. It was a hopeful thing, but it was a production process. But education in general in this country, primary and secondary, is a compulsory process now, and it's an extrusion process, the whole system of which the teachers, and this is the teachers, people don't go into teaching to encourage children's self-pace. They go into teachers as very good monitors of a system pre-established, and they maintain the flow. It's not just upping and downing the pass level of O-levels and A-levels, which are done every year secretly amongst the schools, because you can't afford them to pile up behind, because there's another lot coming through. But it is, in fact, to a large extent, compulsory education is programmed for the convenience of the dispensers to, in fact, to be able to delineate in standards that they've established their terms of selection and grading. Now, universities are voluntary, all right, but the implication of a university education is such that the same sort of people go into university education as teachers, and the extrusion process picks up again. And there isn't much learning in the education process. There's a certain amount of understanding how to be light-footed, but not self-pacing. There's a certain way of...
No, why not? I mean, the first... I mean, if we go back to the first compulsory education, which is job-oriented, in your terms, it was product-oriented.
Yes.
Therefore, that the good 19th century cup and saucer and the safety was the product of that education system. Well, if you remove the object concentrations from the education, it becomes entirely self-sustaining within the bureaucracy of keeping it. Right. Now, the architect is supposed to be the production of an object, a thing. And therefore, the education should be thing-oriented in a very rather old-fashioned way. You know.
If in fact you include, as I suggested at the ArtNet thing, if in fact you realise that architects and their products are provisions, not providers. The architect is a provision. The aim is a happier life. of which an architect in the building happens to be one of the contributions, as with a credit card or fine teeth or free food or whatever, or a better climate. Now, then I agree. But that is not suggested. It's not suggested by careers masters. It certainly isn't suggested to children when they're mentally most capable of taking in information but not retrieving it, which give or take, you know, between the findings of the National Coal Board and the US Navy appears to be between sort of month 3 and year 4.
Can I swing in, Cedric? I'd like to pull in, pull Shepherd, because in the sort of intervening 5 hours or so, we've spun, quite interestingly, complete art from sort of propositions that for instance, your liking for referring back to historicist bases, and in a sense attacking the normal evaluation of the object, whether defined or redefined. Now there's complete, you know, in this 5 hours, complete circle of the conversation. I just wonder whether you're sort of sitting at the back of the ceiling, or what you're
seeing at all. I don't think I was attacking. Speak up! I don't think I was attacking anything this morning either. I think a definition of rip-off might be the one that corrals other people's activities that mean something to them and say they're a waste of time. I don't think you can rip off people from the past.
We have an interesting connection point here, I think, with the primary school and the historicism, I think, should come a bit later, and the university that Cedric Price was talking about. You can have a reversal here, Cedric, where the university, as in Peter Cook, commits itself to this infantile regression. You know, it's this cream and lump of turd and chocolate and this utopia of sexual indulgence. This is what is happening to the universities. This is what's happening to architecture. This is what's happening to, in fact, the culture. And the graveyard theme, I think, to me was very interesting. It was coming over here. Cedric comes along, he's always handing out, as this one said, we haven't got to give them grandfather clocks in one of his annual RIBA performances. We've got to give the kid his wristwatches. What we have is basically the loss of nerve in this culture. And I think Peter Smithson really brought us back to reality, that someone was talking about the other kind of trendy thing, semiotics and the latest fad that was imported from the slightly more sophisticated century Paris, that the trendies from the AA are going to come up here, they take circus art around the provinces every now and again, and they don't know what to do, and they peddle the latest self-indulgence. And after all, what is the regression of infantilism in the university and the intellectual culture but faddism? And what we have here is the monumental worship, the religion of fad. And what is very sad and what is very interesting, very contradictory about it, is that with the Smithsons, we got back to a commitment when it was possible for the environment still to have commitment. And what's happened is that's been shattered. That's been completely shattered. What we've got now is we can't even win. This is the Cod War syndrome here. trying to do Kipling, and it comes back the second time around, as Marx says, history repeating itself as a farce, as a tragedy after the farce. What we've got in all this, I mean, the thing about the Chevy, and the first speaker, the changing fad, he said, it's very interesting, the Chevy of 62 somehow tell you something about the year as the Chevy of 63 had. Sums up the whole basic dynamic, the masturbatory indulgence in faddism. No underlying...
It doesn't turn you blind, there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, I think it is, because I think procreation in this country is something that you know, professionally and universities have got to be involved with. And over here, what was interesting with a different generation, that level of commitment and seriousness that that were used there. And what we have now, as I say, is this infantile regression of cream and lumture, lumture for sculpture. And I think that to me, the most insightful sort of nostalgic self-reflection was the archaeology of the contemporary cultural condition. Basically, that the elite, which this lot represent, all the trendies peddling the latest colour supplement, Hampstead, Northwest, latest fad, are in fact, basically it's the treason of the class. That's what the profession is.
How do you describe yourself? You're giving us.
This is not an ad hominem argument, unless you can deal with even slightly transitional generalizations. You'll not be able to join the general discourse. And since you want to do that, and since you want to indulge in that kind of thing, I mean, you must at least ask for a little credence on my side. So this is not an ad hominem argument. This is an invitation to join the general discourse. And the general discourse is the AA trendies out on the circus, doing their trip.
You're enjoying it.
Could we go back a step? Because I think we stumbled on something. And I don't know where this leads, but I think when we spoke about education, the aims of education when it first became universal, and I think in Europe, the German education, the French education, was aimed at raising the quality of education and spreading it to all, and to raise the quality of the work of the working class in Germany and the agricultural workers, because they had a real primitivism there, which they were very worried about. Where I think in England it was aimed at something quite different. It was aimed at the elimination of poverty. And on that very subtle difference of the original aim, I think this is why the English have gone on this downwards track. Because if you think of the elimination of poverty becoming a chase after goodies and after affluence, you then realize how in a way we've driven ourselves into the ground. That is, we're no longer thinking in terms of quality of objective, of quality of the process. You're just aimed at people being open-mouthed into which everything they can get is received. And it's the loss of some sort of quality that has, in a way, lost the objective for a great number of people.
I think the loss of the quality is largely due, if we keep on education just for a bit longer, is largely due to the products offered by the processors, whether they be called teachers or professors. And that is where the loss of quality has gone, because the product are still those basically defined with what was assumed to be essential literacy to overcome poverty. Now, visual literacy never came into that. Numerical literacy very seldom came into it. My old grammar school has still forbidden the use of battery-operated calculating machines by the sixth form. And when I was there, they stopped us using a slide rule. We had to have log tables. Now, that sort of nonsense, that is where the hold-up has been. Because if you go back to the German example, I mean, the point is, I don't think it matters that 60% of the people joining the army can't read or write. I don't think that is particularly worrying. I do think it's worrying if they can't think. and can't react against good and bad ideas. And I do not see education at the moment providing that choice.
It doesn't matter whether they can think, because you're only after eliminating the poverty.
But I'm all for eliminating poverty, and we haven't done that yet.
They expected them to think, and in France...
Well, but I mean, there is no massive difference between the number of poor, underprivileged people in France as a percentage and in this country.
No,
so neither processes are proven.
I think they're happier there because they can actually... The whole thing is aimed differently. It's aimed at quality of life.
But we don't recognise what quality of life is. I mean, I actually agreed with him, although he was assuming I didn't. I mean, Thomas Carlyle, you know, the ideal university is a collection of books. Thomas Carlyle, period. That's all it is. And the whole point about taking, as you did, and a little bit in relation to products, I agree that the situation, the increased happiness of life is a situation, is a process that always has to be worked at. But the products are capable of wild alteration, and should, by persons like ourselves, those products, the increased range of products, should be made available, should be enabled, and it's a process of enablement, not a production of products. So the situation where, in fact, you then criticize, and I might agree with some of your criticism of end products. What I think is a bit worrying is that I don't, worrying in what you said, is that I don't see that anything on these walls, there may be a few exceptions, I haven't looked at them as closely as you, which is another point, that the products on these walls I see as an interval in a process. There may be studies and trendies and things, I don't know. I mean, I haven't taught at the AA or been on its paybook since 1964, just for the record, but the point Alison was making, I think, is worrying because I don't see that I would have thought that the pressures, again, it might be sort of, I'm only reading it because I can read, but the pressures of the sort of, back to there, you know, the pressures of the sort of higher education in the compulsory secondary period in France would seem actually to be far less humane than the rather sloppier pressures in this country.
Yes, but what do you want it to be humane for? It's the sloppiness that allows all this.
Well, Alison,
it's the lack of dedication of all, right along the line. I mean, in France and Germany, you learn or you drop out, and that is the sorting process. You're a quality object, you know.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. No, well, this is where we disagree. Better not take too far. I don't think they learn. I think they educate themselves to work the process. I don't think that's anything to do with learning.
I don't think the taste of toughness, that it is jolly difficult to get to the next stage, that it is jolly difficult to produce the quality job and all the rest.
But you do that all your life. I mean, one does that all one's...
It's tough, you know, and once you get the taste of toughness, then you start to think and you start to choose and sort for yourself. And it's that toughness that allows the French and the German to have this sense of inner decision. And it doesn't matter what is bombarded at them, somehow there's this hardcore that they can actually make up their own mind and resist the people trying to get them to bow down.
Well, I haven't seen much evidence. I haven't seen much evidence of that. I did see that I mean, you and I used to cut pages out of Stern back in Dover Street days. I haven't seen much evidence that the Germans are less bombarded or significantly less swayed by lush adverts in this country. I mean, I think the national argument...
It's not a nationality thing,
in the
is it?
sense of choice that our people just...
I think what is unhealthy in any of those countries, or indeed any country, is compulsory education during the period at which we present establish it. Because the people who are establishing it are usually twice your size, they don't speak a language, and they're always pushing you on. I mean, I think that is the unhealthy thing, and I don't think that tunes anyone up in the first 15 years to be able to think and select, except in the selection that's been put to them. And the selection that's been put to them is the best way to get the 2/3 recognizably as products at the age of 16.
Isn't that
happens in France and Germany as much here.
Isn't the big difference not a nationality thing, but a generation thing? Take an example now. We've got well over 1 million unemployed in this country. Take the situation in the 30s. Take the situation when there was commitment about this. I think what the difference is, what I've seen here today, is a loss of commitment. It's a self-indulgence. Now, I don't know where that commitment is called up. But it isn't called up by people, squirting, cream and toothpaste all over. I mean, it's the prostitution of, it's the weakening of opposition. We can't find the football to opposition.
What is the commitment to? That's a bit paradoxical. That's why I started trying to start a conversation about self-indulgence and bring it back to Scotland. Because you could say it's a very unpromising. We haven't had many. If you compare what happened in England after the Macintosh period, the kind of the first period of the rip-off, Norman Shaw, Baker, Legend when he was bad, and the apparent, maybe the illusion of consistency and unwillingness to do anything that wasn't right within some inner picture that Macintosh had. But you see, if you look at it from the other side, the strength he was drawing on, which was the graphic tradition, and I'm no Roman. I'm not a historian, but the kind of post-Beardsley haircut, you could say, was the most unhealthy climate in which an architecture could arise. You could imagine. I bring this example up because it's the graphics and the sickliness of that period, viewed through one particular set of glasses, is of the same order as the sickliness that you're saying, that is, you find people's drawings of the analogous skins with cream repulsive at a kind of, and I find it a little distasteful simply because you're transferring one set of images to another condition. But all these things are actually irrational, because what was on, I'm sorry to be apparently so disjointed, but one must record one's reaction to these drawings and to Edinburgh itself, because I was slightly staggered that when the buildings were replaced in the 19th century in George Street, there was often quite strong Palladianism. That is unlike Adam. Where you have this, the basic format is a rusticated base, and then a slightly sort of thing with columns and so on. But that rustication, which you then, if you look around, you certainly find all over the place, below pavement level, the buildings are rusticated. And you say to yourself, well, how? What is the logic of rustication, which we all accept as quite normal to the language of Palladian architecture? Why should you accept graphics, carved graphics that is to make it look like a grotto, as being a reasonable surface finish for a series of stones that are put together at the basement of the building? It's just like the cream, it's nutty, really, because you could have taken quarry stones and said, well, we won't bother to dress them so much below pavement level. You can see a much more objective architecture in another way. But in fact, I'm back to my business, and when it's sufficiently far back or totally foreign to us to question, which is what I suggest for ladies. It's impossible for us to question it because it's part of our, one of the fixes in our architectural landscape, just the same as it's impossible for us to, I don't know whether you were here when I said this, weird that you can accept words as which are written. Well, you can't, I can't accept certain images. You know, I'm just convenient. To repeat what Alison said, that someone like Cedric Price found the whole business of ripping off 420s mixed with 450s graphics by these American designers totally repulsive. And that, I suggest, there is a time interval. That is when the chap is either alive or barely dead. You feel it's stealing. You know, when it's considerable distance back, and you're not involved with the exchange, for some reason that stealing business tends to soften. You know, the same business that one is perfectly happy that Palladian architecture abuses symbolism iconographically. It mutates finishes from one set of procedures to another set, which I would find that I resist. That is why, you know, in Mr. Shepherd's work, you know, I just find it odd that one should use the outline of a black stone rock or whatever. It is an appropriate form for a cave in which you thought people were going to live. You know, that's a rip-off, which I find you know, what has that technology to do with this technology? This technology is to do with, is it nice to work there? Why should it be nice to work? But he finds no stumbling block to that, like I find no stumbling block to the use of vermiculated stonework, which is in imitation of the grooves that would occur naturally with water flowing through a cave. You know, if one worries about architecture, it becomes suddenly knotty, you see, but one actually, operationally, you don't do any thinking at all. You see, I never consider rockets. He never considers the language of modern rockets. Operationally, it's dead simple, you know, that it's an intuition about what is available to one to work with and what is totally outside of that. And that in a way, maybe what schools of architecture got screwed up, because they're too bloody rational. You know, there's too much theory taught at this 3 to 4 year old level, i.e. first go. You know, because at Harvard now they're teaching semiotics and use of symbols in their core course. You think so that they're dealing, they could take one of these pictures and deal with it as an iconographic fact. You know, but they can't put 2 bricks together, or put a staircase in so that the door doesn't swing over it. You know, that is, they've screwed the process. The process of you arrive at a theoretical position by an understanding of an ordinary artisan situation. You know, like I've suddenly started to see less now. And I suddenly realized a lot of corny things, you know, that I can't sharpen a saw, but I know how, in a way, how it's done. The chaps, you bend the things over, one each way, and then you do something with a file. And suddenly you see middle-aged, old carpenters doing. You suddenly realize they don't look at the things on the saw, because they were taught at 14. So the whole operation is totally unintellectual, non-visual. Yeah. And they're not using their eyes to turn these things over. It's some remarkable instinct they're using. And unless you can drive that instinct in at a critical age, you can't teach any artisan activity. An architecture, after all, is an artisan activity. Yeah. You know, just drawing and messing about with bits of wood.
But I think the key words are drive it in. This is what they still have on the continent. They transmit that it is tough and you've got to be tough with yourself. Whereas here we've gone all sloppy.
What strikes me about this event such as that club was that it's about architecture, I gather, network and things, and the architectonic quality is the one thing that seems to be lacking. I was just discussing this, I think it's Cedric and Peter Wilson, the possibility of a publisher doing this into book form. Now, here is an example, in my mind, of the kind of thinking that seems to be necessary at all seminars and all discussions of this sort. How to bring it all together. I agree that it is very trendy. It is very trendy. Things we saw in New York 10 years ago seem to keep popping up in all sorts of ways. And this is the same in the Marco Gallery and all the places we go to just now. Now, the words that have come up, and the people that excited me most were the two people who have had a temple for a house designed for a kiter, for somebody flying kites. Now the Chinese have a proverb, if you're uptight, if you're really built up about something, go fly a kite. And I think in a way it's what society, if you want to generalise what I think is all about now. We've got to go and fly kites. We've got to get this feeling of being at the end of two strings and making this black dragon go 100 miles an hour, scream down, hit a man's hat off and they are in the crowd and then scream up again. This is the kind of world that the relevant one that's come through in all the speakers today to my word is responsiveness. And that's what architectonics is all about, how to respond immediately. You may have this idea with the continental attitude to education, the hard firm up at 8 in the morning, finish at 5, and all seems very tough, but at the end of the day, it's what produces responsiveness. And I think everywhere you do get the responsive student, the responsive person coming out in a situation. And I think that here, one says, now how could one take? See, we're waiting on people to take these trainings. They're all fascinating. And there's talks illustrating and doubling and qualifying what we've seen here visually. It's all been absolutely fascinating. But how on earth to draw it all together? We have Beethoven, a genius, as you see, and make it into something complete. That's what was the Macintosh symbol is, of course, the one that we from Glasgow just automatically use. Here's a man who started the east wing of the building 10 years before the west wing. And then there's all that 20 years of thinking, drinking in the art club, boozing and all the whole thing, and doing Miss Cranston's theorem and so on. And then out of this came this fantastic 2,500 points of detail, which just was, to my mind, well, I mean, another one I'm looking for, it was architecture. He put it all together. And actually that's what we're looking for everywhere now, trying to put all this sort of thing together, because there's an enormous amount of thinking. Look, comment this hairdryer on that third picture there. Absolutely. I have roared with laughter with that song. It's absolutely genius there. But how to put it all together in a way which would make more people see it, that's what I think is important.
I think there seems to be quite a lot of misunderstanding going on here. Personally, I don't see how you can really differentiate so much between indulgence and commitment. It depends on your attitude. And I think it's ridiculous wiping off some of this stuff just as trendy. And what do you mean by trendy? I think it means that you don't understand what it's about. There seems to be quite a lot of misunderstanding here. And maybe that it's the inability to realize that things have changed. Things don't have to be as they were. Also, I've not heard any young person speak.
But real human problems dealing with that. And none of the other people, none of the problems, so they may be very matched. In fact, in Paul Shepherd's work, I thought it was fantastic to see so much skill, but it's so sad to see it employed in such a self-indulgent way. There's no commitment among these people here who go outside. And there seems to be two movements in architecture at the present time. To move either in a social direction and move towards recognition of what people want, and maybe to evolve forms which express some of these social commitments, otherwise we're drawn into sort of an artistic level. Now this may be an artistic exhibition, but it certainly is not, I think, doesn't in any sense contribute to, in a positive way, towards any of the architectural problems which a lot of people are facing. On our road, the essential problems of the human habitat doesn't change.
But
I think this sort of injunction doesn't help.
If you want to express an architectural idea, to produce a building isn't necessarily the only way of doing it. And there are ideas expressed in what we've seen here today, or has been talked about, that other people here can go away and transmute into their own work. And the idea is being expressed. Or it might be self-indulgent, but if all these people did their paintings and then hid them in cellars in the AA and kind of looked at them themselves. But by bringing them up here, showing them, then they're spreading their ideas, and they're not just self-indulgent.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have thought that they were saying that they're not going to develop from these ideas. Surely the idea comes before the actual putting it into reality. And that is exactly what they're expressing.
See, this is the problem. There's so many people turn down modern technology and gimmicks and time machines and time houses, plug out houses and inflatable domes. And the problem is that so many people are unemployed in terms of housing, conditions of housing. And the two key issues that you mentioned, the problems of housing in Oxford today, which are outside the modern switching plug-on problems which people aren't facing. While people complain in majority and architects retreat from the criticisms of people in relation to standards of housing and the standards of environment, and both in terms of town planning and in terms of architecture in general, architects are on the run, and they usually indulge in this visual gymnastics then to try and get out of this situation. But they retreat up against the wall with things that in the visual sense you don't really understand what we're at. But none of this is helping you. I ask you, give me an example of any of the project where this sort of stuff has come through, and we've seen some implementation of some of the ideas here. I mean, I see no project, no one discussed one single, it doesn't have to be a building, but where in a sense has anything been done, which is in a positive sense has contributed to the environment, to people's welfare. Assuming, that's why I can give you the people has not been mentioned except by Mr. Smith in relation to any of these projects.
Well, I think a lot of what Peter Smithson, where he's been trying to relate his buildings very much to the environment and to try and make people understand the ways that architecture can become much more a part of the environment, that they can understand as they enjoy nature, that they enjoy architecture. And he's trying to pull that together and possibly trying to explain it in ways that people can relate to.
Well, I can remember very well when Peter was doing this mural at the Martins. You remember? It was these few you quoted it. Now, let's be quite honest about this. He didn't finish it, and I don't know whether it was intended. I mean, if there had been more time, perhaps there would be. But I just remember the social milieu, and other people here will confirm this, of the Barclay Gallery at that period. That there was this need for something on this wall, and there was this event, and I felt it was symptomatic of the situation that it couldn't be finished. Now, just let me jump right for a second to the thing that's hottest in my mind, kiting just now. Now, could my two friends here take up a challenge which I'll make? I go to so many of these seminars that I get fed up. Nobody has anything practical. I think this chap's dead right. Come with something practical and say it. Now, I am at the present moment involved in a book on prison art and prison reform. Now, I don't think anybody who's ever been in prison or visited one will not realize that's one of the big, major social problems of our age. The way our prisoners are treated in prisons is appalling. Now, what do you do to break down this wall? You have 400 years of it's a medieval, you've got, I mean, it's so old a problem that, it's like the Northern Ireland problem, no solution. But for the moment, we're trying to devise ways of getting these people out psychologically. Now, one thing we've devised, we've got the Scottish champion kiting to come along and demonstrate kiting in Carstairs State Prison. They will then, the prisoners, or the patients as they call them nowadays, will feel that some bit of them is outside doing 100 miles an hour on the way up above Carstairs. Now, would my friends here take up the challenge tonight and be interested in designing, well, to extend your kiting, what was it, a home for a kite flyer, and do something, design it for Carstairs State Hospital. You might get a fee, you might not, but well, that's practical.
Yeah, but Bill, look here. I mean, the crime rate in this country and Denmark, serious crimes, has increased almost identically, year by year, this country and Denmark, for the last 10 years. In this country, we're bringing in artists, we're doing artistic grills, still with sharp points, and Lord Mountbatten is getting recommendations from the RIBA for architects for new high-security prisons. In Denmark, they're pulling prisons down and not rebuilding. Now, neither action has had one iota of difference on the increase of crime rates. Back to his point, I mean, he reminded me earlier on tonight, the last time we met was, what, 12 years ago, when you showed me around that memorial to the misuse, if it could ever be otherwise, of class, York University. And we then went, and the point I point out, which you remember, was that I wasn't interested in the university, but I was fascinated by the merciless quality of York, where every floor, apart from the ground floor, appeared to be empty in the town itself. You see, but they were building a new university. With lots of spaces, there were old Magoo's, you know, Christmas cracker shop and bun shop and places where they shake old age pensions upside down, sixpence out of them to save that bloody Minster and the rest. Now, it comes back to the point, you see, that lovely to think we've got a little bit of outside, you know, just like a ballad of Reading Jail, you know, a bit of, yeah, that's a bit outside as well. You can put it in words and we still have to pay to read it. But the process, I don't think, is impractical. I think that if architecture comes up with an answer of continuing you know, to a particular situation, not a problem, it's too late. If you have a problem, we'll decide it. Don't face a problem, face it. It's too late if it's called a problem. Architecture deals with a situation. Not everyone, you know, you're long faced with a problem, and an architect says, I've solved the problem, and you're meant to smile. It doesn't matter what the quality of the solution is. So we avoid problems. And we avoid problems primarily in the process, along which you don't have doors jamming on the top step of the second flight, absolutely agree, along with which someone might actually realize how you make a kite that flies rather than just looks good in a drawing, I quite agree. But continuously, you don't have the boring academicism of sheltered people, whether they be in universities, schools of architecture, or anywhere else, saying, we can't actually comment on your contribution unless you put a product in front of us. Now, product should be spin-offs. Architecture, I don't think, I've never seen architecture as a collection of products. I see architecture as a continuous process. As I said, with this, I mean, the safety pin, I could redefine it, I'm sure, in trendy ways that would be acceptable as a fine bit of digital architecture.
One in this room. I think you're in a minority.
It's happened before.
That is that architecture.
You must study it, that's
That is, we make it, you study it. We regard them as facts. That is,
I make them.
They're active, like people are beautiful and all.
No, but architecture is such bits of architecture.
Processes. They exist once they're made. No, the process.
Don't you start from
No, but I think, you know, it's like we're not just, we're splitting hairs here. I mean,
what you mean by process.
Well, I think the replacement, you know, the fact that widows aren't asked to wear their husband's false teeth is an acceptable human process, whereas the product of actually designing another set and building another set of false teeth, which pound for pound is more expensive than a building, is the spin-off of the process of not requiring widows to wear their husband's false teeth. Now, that process, I think, is dental medicine. The making of false teeth, I think, is a spin-off of it.
Right.
Right. So, and
But now do it prerogative.
Right. Okay. Let's take an example. My little computer centre, which cost a sixth of the cost of the computer, is coming down in 18 months' time. 1 year after, they've scrapped the computer. But they are still computing their wages, and for that period of time, that particular accommodation for that particular machine and all the little boring analysts and programmers was suitable. But the process hasn't stopped that was started by that particular product.
Yeah, well, that's where we are.
You know, but the Lavridge's work, and look marvellous at sunset.
I was the ones that made the thing. I would like to want to keep them to keep the thing.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't.
I'm just saying that you may be in a minority part. That surely the quality that you have a nice nail. Now there are two ways of looking at it. That is a thing that is used to part of the process of getting it flawed. It's also a thing. You know, something you pick it up and you keep it. So connect the things that I would like to make things that people are so affectionate about. They keep them like they pick up a nail. That is, it's nothing to do with the function. It's in the thing. The quality is in the making and the notion is valuable, like any work of art.
It doesn't have to last to be valuable. That's why I talked about food.
It doesn't have to be last to be valuable.
Food that looks nice and food that looks nasty. It doesn't have to last to be valuable. It doesn't have to be an object of delight that people treasure.
No, it doesn't. But all of the things that are transient works of art, like people have collections of bus tickets. That is I don't think really this question of how long they physically last comes into it. Because carpets you throw away, yet one of the most.
And Shakespeare was supposed to be spoken in the accent they used when he wrote it.
Right.
And we don't. And what has lasted? Just because Fred Caxton.
But what is surviving is the notion.
Oh, that's all right. That's okay. That's all right. Not the product.
But it's supposed to be so. Now, I need a week to think about the change.
But it doesn't matter that we disagree. It doesn't make the work involved any less necessary. I agree with that.
What seems to be interesting about architecture is that something that's gone wrong with architecture that is so dull is its disconnection from fantasy in some way. That is a notion projection. The notions in the sense that we argue about, which are society or whatever. But the notions such as you get in an ordinary art school atmosphere, where the fashion trend, development of the change of graphics, the change of the way we speak, is all of them are artful. And it seems to be now proven that when they decided as a governmental policy to detach schools of architecture and schools of art, that something was missing. Now what people could see is that is put